All right. Hello, everyone. We are going to give everyone a moment or two to join the webinar, but I'm seeing plenty of people joining, so we'll be right with you. All right, seeing a good crowd. We're just going to give it another minute. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar titled From Brain Fog to Benefits, Navigating ERISA and Winning Long COVID Disability Appeals. My name is Andrew Wylam, and I'm the president of Pandemic Patients, and I'm joined today by Andrew Kantor, who's a senior partner with Kantor and Kantor LLP. Before we begin today, our webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. Everyone who is registered will receive an email once it's available. Also, closed captions are available. To enable those, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We're hosting today's webinar to discuss the rules and requirements disability insurance companies must follow when handling claims, why insurers deny disability insurance claims for long COVID, and how to improve your chances of success when applying for disability insurance benefits. We'll have some time at the end for questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions for us. Now, let's get started. All right, so first we're going to set the stage with the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, or ERISA. And the reason this is important is because this is a federal law that governs most disability insurance plans. And it preempts state insurance remedies, meaning that state insurance laws can't be you can't sue under those laws for remedies that aren't available under ERISA. And so that's limiting in some ways. And I'm going to have Andrew talk about that just a little bit about what that means. So go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Andrew, for having me. So what this does basically, what ERISA does, and this is frankly one of the reasons why insurance as a whole is so problematic in the United States, at least in my opinion, is ERISA stops you from being able to sue an insurance company for state insurance bad faith remedies. So what that means is if your insurance plan is governed by state law, let's say you're in California, in my state, and an insurance company denies you $100 worth of benefits, you could sue the insurance company for the $100, and you could also sue them for additional damages on top of that. Punitive damages, consequential damages, emotional distress damages. Basically, it could be very expensive for an insurance company in that situation to wrongfully deny your claim. Under ERISA, if you're wrongfully denied, all you can sue for is that $100. And maybe some attorney's fees on top. What this means is that an insurance company doesn't have anything to fear when they deny your claim, because all you can sue them for is the benefits they owe anyways. I work with my father who uses the example of, imagine if the only penalty for robbing a bank was if you got caught robbing it, you'd have to pay the money back with interest. How many more people would be out there trying to rob a bank? Because why not? There's no real penalty for giving it a shot. So that's why so many of these claims end up being denied.
That is some great context. So for most of these claims, they are going to have to play by the rules of ERISA. And so we've got listed on this slide what the most common rules are. And so, for instance, when you first make a claim for benefits, the insurer will need to make a decision within 45 days. There may be some exceptional circumstances where you can get extensions, but generally 45 days is what you're looking at. And if they deny your claim, you're going to have 180 days to appeal that denial. Of course, again, you can get extensions if you need them, but you'll have at least 6 months to contest that decision. You're entitled to a full and fair review as well, which means you have a right to request your claim file and any other internal rules that the insurer relied on when they made that decision. They're entitled to independence and impartiality of the decision makers. You are entitled to have detailed reasons for why your claim was denied, and you can rebut any new evidence that is generated in the course of your appeal. And so there is also something called the exhaustion of remedies. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, Andrew?
Yeah. So this is a really important aspect of ERISA. As Andrew pointed out, you have 180 days to appeal the denied disability claim. Not only are you required to appeal within 180 days, you have to appeal before you're allowed to file a lawsuit in court. Sometimes you have to appeal once. Some policies actually require you to appeal more than once. I already told you the biggest thing I hate about ERISA, which is the remedy scheme. The second biggest thing I hate about ERISA is that if you do not appeal within those 180 days, even if you appeal late, the insurance company can argue you've waived your right to sue entirely. So you appeal on day 182, they can just say, we're not looking at it, we deny it. And then if you file a lawsuit in federal court, the judge may say, I don't even have to look at this because you failed to appeal on time. There are some arguments you can try to make in some circumstances, but in most circumstances, it closes the door on your claim. So it is extraordinarily important to not only appeal, but appeal timely.
Great points, Andrew. And that last bullet about extra contractual damages is what Andrew explained before about robbing a bank. All right, so now that we covered the basics, let's dig into the meat. So what are some common reasons why insurers deny long COVID claims? I'm going to kick that over to you, Andrew.
Yeah. So for a little bit of context, insurers love denying all claims of all kinds. They've been targeting different kind of claims for years. You know, they used to target fibromyalgia claims before there was more evidence that fibromyalgia was real. They used to target and still do target ME/CFS claims before, ironically, long COVID gave it some credibility that it didn't have before, at least according to insurance companies. But what they like to do is attack claims where there's not traditional medical objective evidence of an impairment. So if you break your leg, there's an x-ray which can show that you've broken your leg, and pretty much all doctors agree if you break your leg, you can't walk on it for a certain amount of time. Your surgery may go wrong, and they agree you may not be able to walk on it for a little bit longer. If you have a spine condition, you can look at MRIs. If the list goes on of things that are provable. The things like long COVID or any fatigue-related illness doesn't have a traditional test where all doctors look at it and say, oh, we all agree that this test means you are this impaired by long COVID or any other fatigue-related illness. So you may see doctors constantly. Your doctors may run a plethora of tests. What an insurance company may say is, yes, we understand that you claim to have this condition, but there's no objective medical evidence of disability. What they're basically saying is, we want something that doesn't exist. They love using this argument against people with migraines as well. We understand you argue you have migraines, but there's no test out there which proves that you have them or proves that they're as bad as you say. So they're basically forcing you to create evidence that they know doesn't exist in a kind of way to try and justify denying the claims. On the same token, what they'll do is argue that your symptoms are self-reported. Just like there's no objective evidence of fatigue, at least according to insurance companies, they'll argue that your fatigue or your pain is self-reported and not properly verified. So this can be problematic in two kind of distinct ways. One is that they'll use these arguments to just deny the claim as a whole. What they'll say is there's just not enough evidence to prove it, thus you have to give us more evidence. The other way it can be a problem is some policies will actually have self-reported symptom limitations in them. So they'll say, yes, we agree that you're disabled, but it's all self-reported, so we're only paying you for 2 years. So the advice I can give you in that regard is make sure to look at your policy and know if these limitations are in there, and try to take a look at them. And there's ways to preempt them or avoid them, or even get certain evidence which can overcome those limitations. Another big reason that claims are denied is because the treating provider didn't specify restrictions and limitations. This is often a problem because the form the doctor will ask questions like, how long can you sit? How long can you stand? How much can you lift? How much can you carry? How much can you push and pull? They're trying to assess your disability according to the old school, blue collar definitions of work that existed 70 years ago, right? Sedentary, light, medium, or heavy, where there's no box to say how bad is your fatigue? How bad is your brain fog? How frequently do you experience brain fog? How's your post-exertional malaise? They don't ask questions like that. So what the doctor will often do is check the box. Yeah, I guess this person can sit for a certain amount of time. I guess they can lift for a certain amount of time, and not realize that they're basically hurting your disability claim by not explaining what is actually limiting you. So the insurance company will say your doctor didn't specify restrictions, limitations. Well, your doctor just filled out the form and sent the medical records. They didn't know they had to give more information. Um, so that can often be a really big one as well.
Yeah, so I
Uh,
want to circle back to what you mentioned earlier about objective medical evidence, and something that I think this is something that can be hard for people to understand because the difference between subjective and objective might not be immediately apparent to them. But I like to use an illustration where, what we're dealing with when we give the insurance company information about your disability is your medical records. And this is all on paper. They're not looking at you as a person, they're just looking at what is on the page. And based on what's on the page, that has to objectively verify that you're impaired. And so it's the difference between someone saying, I am tired and I can't handle much exercise, as opposed to this patient performed an evaluation to measure their exercise tolerance and they performed below a certain threshold. And so the information like that is much more persuasive for proving eligibility, as opposed to a self-reported measure saying, I can't exercise like I used to. So I hope that illustration helps people understand really how important this is. Um,
you know,
and one
and
thing that I've come across with my clients sometimes is questions about intensity of care, where a lot of people might have very, very severe self-reported symptoms, but when you look at the actual care that they're receiving from their treating doctors and specialists, it just doesn't line up with what they're claiming they're going through. Where if you have certain symptoms of a certain severity, you would think you're going to be going to the doctor with some regularity to figure out what's going on or to manage those symptoms or to obtain treatment. But if you're not doing those things, that can actually work against you because the insurance company will say, we don't really believe you because you're not pursuing treatment for this in the way that we would expect you to.
yeah, that that happens in all kinds of claims, and usually the context is well, one of two things. One is that people aren't able to access the specialist they need because they can't afford it, or because they're not available, or because they're not just not around. The other aspect is sometimes people will go to their doctor and their doctor says, okay, see me again in 4 months, follow your medications. If you need anything, reach out to me by email. There's nothing else you can do. Um, and people follow their doctor's instructions, and then all of a sudden they're denied because they're only seeing a doctor every 4 months or every 6 months. So the most important aspect of this, when we're talking about all these things, there's a ton of things an insurance company might do to unfairly deny a claim that there's no way to avoid it because they're just being unfair, and all you can do is fight back. This is one of those examples. In some ways, I can't recommend people get more treatment than they otherwise can, because I know a lot of people can't afford it. They don't have the access to it. So the only time this can really cause a problem that can't be overcome is if your doctor recommends that you get more treatment or do something and you don't follow through. Because what the insurance company will say is that if we understand that you may not be able to afford something, but your doctor said you should do this. And if your condition is bad enough that you aren't able to work, then you should have done the thing your doctor said. So non-compliance, from their perspective, can be kind of a bigger argument to them than if you are following your doctor's orders and seeing a doctor every 6 months and they say, that's not enough. Especially, in the days of telemedicine, where they're starting to accept telemedicine a lot more. If you can only see your doctor in person every 6 months, try to check in via telemedicine, remotely, because that can go a long way as well.
Mhm. And one thing I want to highlight here as well is about inconsistent documentation, where if someone is seeing multiple providers and specialists and they get medical records from one of those doctors and maybe a letter of support that is then contradicted by what another doctor said, the insurance company is really going to latch onto that and say, well, we believe this instead of that. And we're going to use this as a reason to deny your claim, where otherwise that other doctor's opinion would have carried. So make sure that when you're visiting your doctors and you're producing your medical records, that things are consistent.
Yeah.
And then, yeah,
To
go
add,
ahead.
sorry, to add to that really quickly, not only, I mean, if you have 5 doctors and 4 of them support disability and one does not, the insurance company will look at that one doctor, and arguably a judge, if they get the case, will say, well, the insurance company looked at your doctor and relied on your doctor. It's not unreasonable to choose one doctor instead of the 4. So one doctor who undermines disability can really undermine the whole case. Don't be too afraid of an insurance company using basically harmless inconsistencies against you. You know, if one doctor says you're fatigued for 8 hours after activity, another doctor says it's 7 hours, as long as they all support that you're generally disabled and that the story doesn't contradict itself so severely that it's suspect. It's There are always going to be some minor inconsistencies because the doctors aren't perfect. But make sure if you have a doctor who's not supportive, I'd consider seeing another doctor because that can sink your disability claim.
Mhm. Absolutely. And one of the last things on this slide is a failure to cooperate with the insurer. So some insurance policies, most of them actually, will have a provision that says that they can require you to see a doctor or specialist of their choosing to receive an independent medical evaluation. And if you fail to cooperate with that, that could actually be a standalone reason for them to deny your claim. And so you want to avoid that at all costs. So if they contact you and say, you need to go to this doctor at this time for this appointment so we can have an independent evaluation of you, it's very important that you comply. And I don't want to get into all the mechanics of IMEs, but I want to really focus on that can really be used against you. So don't take that lightly. Anything else on this slide you want to focus on, Andrew?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, if you have long COVID and you're being sent for an IME, everything Andrew just said is right. You absolutely have to go because they can automatically deny you for refusing to comply, and every policy has that provision. Um, at the same time, if they are sending you to an IME, if you have long COVID, they are trying to deny your claim. And this is not always the case. If you have a back issue or you have other issues that can actually be verified by a traditional IME, they're not necessarily trying to deny you. Maybe they're just trying to verify things. But if you have a fatigue related illness and they're sending you to an in person exam, you have to go, but you should also, I strongly consider talking to a lawyer or making sure your medical records are up to date because they're looking for a reason to deny, because everyone knows a 1 hour exam with a doctor is not the way to assess a fatigue related illness, especially long COVID. So be very mindful of that as well.
Absolutely. I do see some questions in the chat. I do want to remind people, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll get back to most of those at the end. But there's one I do want to ask right now while we're on the topic. If you are subjected to an IME by the insurance company, can you request that it be a specialist in your condition?
It's a great question. You can and should request anything you want. You should request that it's the right specialist. You could give them a list of doctors who you'd approve of that are in your area. I can almost promise you they will disagree. They will reject your requests. But it's really important and can be really helpful to document your request. So if if a lawyer's going to come in and say this IME was ridiculous, it's not worth relying on, they sent someone to the wrong expert. Look, the client even pointed it out, and they rejected these requests to send the person to a reasonable expert. Documenting that paper trail can be really important in showing how they're unreasonable they are, but you should not expect them to actually comply with your requests. I've never seen, I shouldn't say never, it's very rare for them to actually agree. The only time I've seen them do that is when they can't find someone in their arsenal of reviewers who is available or close enough to your physical proximity.
Absolutely. All right, we'll move on to the next slide now. Here we're going to talk about how to objectively document your long COVID symptoms. So on this slide, there's a lot of options here for things that are commonly used to provide objective medical documentation for symptoms associated with long COVID. The two at the top are, I think, the most important by far, and in my experience, have been the most useful for winning claims and appeals. So I'll talk about the first two briefly. So the neuropsychological evaluation, that is a long test where you are evaluated by a neuropsychologist, and they're really testing multiple different domains of cognitive function to identify where there might be deficits. And it's something where it's scored using standard measures. And so when you perform poorly on it, it does provide that objective documentation that you are below average or impaired even on some domains of cognitive function. That's usually the first step I go to with long COVID because it's a more accessible evaluation as opposed to the 2-day CPET, which I think can be sometimes it's just a little bit harder to find a specialist to perform the evaluation. And the 2-day CPET, it's a cardiopulmonary exercise test. And what this is designed to focus on and evaluate is chronic fatigue and post-exertional malaise. That's why it's a 2-day test, because on 2 days, you're going to receive the same evaluation on your exercise capacity. And if you have post-exertional malaise, you will demonstrate a downturn on the second day with how much exercise you can actually partake in. So those are really, really important measures. But what's really difficult about these is that they're typically not going to be covered by insurance. So you're going to have to pay out of pocket. And a neuropsych evaluation is probably in the range of $2,500, and a 2-day CPET could be somewhere in the range of $3,000. So it's not the most accessible thing, especially when you are appealing a claim that's already been denied and you've lost your income. But they're very, very important things to use. We've also got a couple of other things on this slide. An MRI can be used for brain imaging or imaging other parts of your body to identify, maybe you have some lesions in your brain that are actually causing some of your cognitive issues. And there's also a tilt table test that's used to diagnose POTS. And then there's some lab work you can get, but in my experience, insurers more easily just look past lab work unless it's consistently very far out of range, and it's also like can be closely associated with specific symptoms you're experiencing. So things like C-reactive protein, which we know is associated with systemic inflammation, you could have that, pretty high out of bounds for a while. And I've still had insurers come back and say, well, that's not good enough evidence of impairment. And then if you have depression and anxiety or other mental health conditions, you can use your psychotherapy notes to demonstrate that. But in some instances, your claim can be limited to 24 months or even 12 months based on your policy if your impairment is predominantly a mental health condition. And that's something we'd like to avoid. But if it's the only option that you have to get coverage for that first year or two, then it's still a good option. And then if you have speech therapy or physical therapy notes, those can be helpful to demonstrate your impairment as well. And the last on the list is helpful, but not always dispositive. And that is a symptom journal. And so that's where you can track your symptoms over time and provide those to the insurer to say, this is how I experience my symptoms. I have good days and bad days. And you can also support that data with data from wearables. So like any wristband or armband that measures your heart rate over time or other vitals, that can provide some good data to show that you might have a cardiovascular impairment or, with dysautonomia, that your blood pressure fluctuates based on your physical activity. So these are a lot of really common things that we like to lean on, but I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to see if there's anything else you want to talk about on this topic.
Yeah, just a few things here and there. With the neuropsychological evaluation, that's something that's both technically available through your medical insurance, through your traditional medicine, or something you can pay for out of pocket. The 2-day CPET you can only pay for out of pocket, and it's only the two major labs are in Northern California and New York, and there may be other ones that I'm not aware of. One thing people ask me a lot is with a neuropsych evaluation is whether they should get it done through their insurance or pay for it out of pocket. The safest thing by far to do is pay for it out of pocket. And there's a few main reasons why. One, when you get a neuropsychologist through your medical insurance, they're almost always generalists, or they specialize in things that aren't disability, basically. And so this poses a problem because they're not familiar with disability in the way they test things. It poses a bigger problem for people with long COVID and fatigue related illnesses because your fatigue can show up as malingering or exaggeration of symptoms in the neuropsych evaluation, which would deem the whole thing irrelevant. So you need to have a specialist who's both familiar with disability and familiar with fatigue related illnesses and how to test them. So that's really important. The other thing is that if you get it done through your medical insurance and it doesn't end up being supportive because they're not familiar with this stuff, the insurance company is going to see it. If you pay for it out of pocket and for some reason it's not supportive, you never have to submit it, and so they never can use it against you. So that's really important to keep in mind about the neuropsych, which we call the neuropsych evaluation. As far as psychotherapy notes, one thing I also like to point out is that I'd say most of my clients, regardless of why they are disabled, are getting mental health treatment because they're disabled. So most people, even if you aren't disabled from mental health issues, are getting mental health treatment, and I think that's a really good thing. So don't feel like your psychotherapist is necessarily going to only support the a mental health aspect of the claim. I mean, if you're getting mental health treatment and you're talking to your therapist about how devastating your long COVID is and how disabling it, and telling them that you're not disabled for mental health issues, they're a great person to support that you're disabled not for mental health issues. I mean, who better to support that you're not disabled for mental health issues and thus potentially limited under the claim than a mental health professional. The other thing I'll mention is Andrew's completely right, which symptom journals and wearables aren't necessarily dispositive. One thing I have personally noticed is that symptom journals, especially if kept somewhat consistently, have become a lot more persuasive in front of judges, because a lot of these cases often come down to someone with a lot of credibility saying that they're impaired, but they're not being enough in the medical records to really support the day to day. But then you put the medical records along with this kind of daily or weekly journal, which documents things, it can be really persuasive. The other thing you can do is give your symptom journal to your doctor and say, this is what I'm going through. And so they understand your daily symptoms. And then anything they're certifying says, yeah, this is based off of my knowledge of what she's going through every day, or what this person's going through every day, combined with what I'm seeing them, in the office. And that can make their opinions more persuasive.
Those are great points. I completely agree. We have a question from Vivian.
Mm.
For neuropsych exams and the 2-day CPET, is it necessary to redo them every few years to remain current? In other words, do these tests go stale from the insurer's perspective?
Yes. Okay, so let me kind of answer that with more nuance. So the tests do go stale from an insurance company's perspective. A neuropsych exam is considered about 2 year has a 2 year date basically, where they'll consider it valid for about 2 years, and then they can demand another one. 2-day CPET's a little more up in the air. There's no real agreed upon timeline for how long they last. So that's a little more kind of that's a little more mushy. It is somewhat common for insurance companies to ask for updated neuropsych evaluations at the any occupation stage at the 2 year mark, especially if the initial claim is based on cognitive impairment. I don't think it would. So I think if they ask you for another neuropsych evaluation, there's nothing you can do to avoid that. I would recommend getting your own instead of going to their neuropsychologist. But it's going to be hard to say that that's not something that you'd have to do under the policy. A 2-day CPET, because there's a lot less knowledge about it, and I do know that there is a lot of concern about the crash that the 2-day CPET causes. I think you would have a much better um, you'd be in a much better position to not have to do the 2-day CPET compared to a neuropsych, especially because the probably most important reason is that the neuropsych, if supportive, should make it so you don't need the 2-day CPET. Usually, if a neuropsych evaluation is supportive enough of disability, you don't need the additional evidence of fatigue. So what I would potentially do is try the neuropsych first, and if you even want to undergo one, there's a possibility they approve the claim without making you undergo one. But I'd undergo the neuropsych first and see how that goes. And if for some reason they push for a 2-day CPET, which is unusual, admittedly, because they don't usually push for helpful evidence, you
Mhm.
can have your doctor write a letter basically saying, there's no reason that she should be submitted to this. She did it once and it can be risky. So she doesn't have to do it again.
Definitely. And I really agree with you on the crash factor with the 2-day CPET. I really have a hard time recommending that for clients until we go through the neuropsych eval, because I really don't wish that upon anyone. I know it's a pretty terrible experience. But then one other factor too is that I have seen more policies that have the limitation for MECFS,
Mm.
and I don't see that limitation for neurocognitive disorder really frequently at all. And so we do prefer the neuropsych eval first so that, that's not going to be a time limited approval.
That's an extremely good point. It's important to look for your policies for fatigue related illness limitations. Also important to look at how the mental health limitation is worded, because some of them, what they'll say is anything in the DSM-5 counts as a mental health issue. So technically, even mild cognitive impairment is in the DSM-5. So in that situation, you can't even use that argument. You have to try and go around both of them. But that can be really tough. Often it doesn't say that. So neurocognitive disorder should always work as something that's not limited by the mental health limitation.
Yep. We've got one more question from Brandy. This might not be something we have a good answer for, but do you know if there's a certain timeline for retesting for POTS using a tilt table test?
I'm not. If you get a supportive test, you shouldn't need a retest. If you get an unsupportive test, I would have no idea how long you'd have to wait to get another supportive test.
All right. Anything else on this slide we want to talk about before we move on? All right. Next one, we're going to talk about other ways to strengthen your appeal. So why don't you take us away, Andrew?
Sure. So there's a lot of ways to strengthen your claim or appeal before you get started. You know, one of them obviously is build a strong claim before you apply. The best way to do that is to talk to your doctors first before you even get started with the process. You know, sometimes it's obvious where your doctor's the one telling you to stop working. Sometimes it doesn't even come up. You're suffering, just telling them what you're going through, and it's assumed that you can still handle work until you can't. So make sure you're telling your doctor everything. Make sure your doctor is supportive of disability. And I also strongly recommend requesting your own medical records. If you haven't seen them before, and do a formal request, however your office does it. Sometimes the records you get in the portal are not your formal records. So you'll get like summaries, you'll get, I'm not entirely sure how they all do it, but you want to see what they're going to be sending to the insurance company. If there's something, under HIPAA, you have the right to um, correct any factually incorrect information in your medical records. Now, if you disagree with an opinion, you can't have them then put that wrong. But if there's something that they put in that's wrong, you can have that fixed. So make sure there's nothing in there that is incorrect and can potentially harm your claim. Um, if you're doing an appeal, one thing to consider doing is to get a vocational evaluation. There are services out there that basically will, these people are experts in what jobs someone can do based on their limitations. And sometimes what an insurance company will say is, we understand your limitations, but we think you could do these different jobs, especially once you hit the any occupation period. A vocational expert can do an evaluation and basically write a report explaining why you couldn't do any of these jobs because you're not, either regularly employable or reliable or any of those reasons. One reason that's important is because they have their own vocational person who's always writing their own reports. And if you get in front of a judge, it can be really important to have that rebutted. Um, Another extraordinarily strong aspect of a long-term disability appeal can be getting approved for Social Security disability. If you're a long-term disability lawyer like me and you're evaluating a case and you see someone was denied for long-term disability, but they were approved for Social Security, you almost know the long-term disability company screwed something up because the Social Security standard is harder to meet than the long-term disability standard. So if the Social Security Administration, who's not all that friendly in the first place, decides that you're disabled, the long-term disability company should have made that decision as well. So make sure you are applying for Social Security. I strongly recommend considering hiring a lawyer, a Social Security lawyer. If you're on long-term disability, the long-term disability company will offer you a long-term disability lawyer. Strongly consider getting your own. Your own lawyer is going to do a better job for you. They're also going to protect your interests as far as strategizing the claim to make sure as to not push things from the Social Security aspect that could hurt your long-term disability claim, like push the mental health aspect of your long COVID, which I've seen some long-term disability sponsored disability or SSDI companies try to do, clearly to try and serve their LTD masters, so to speak.
Mhm.
Make sure you are getting supportive letters from your providers and specialists. As I referenced before, by default they'll get a form that has them fill out your restrictions, limitations. The form is not designed for long COVID. So as I tell everyone, tell your doctor to not be limited to the form. They should write their own letter and staple it, fill in the basics and then basically explain everything that you're going through in detail. The letter should explain your treatment history, what they've done to try and treat your issues, a list of diagnoses, and a detailed explanation of why you're not able to work. It should explain your fatigue. It should explain the cognitive impairment. It should explain what they've observed and also, what you've reported and why they believe these things. If your claim is denied, you have the right to request your claim file, which has all the information in it. And in the claim file will be the insurance company's, basically their doctor deciding why you are not disabled. The arguments in there are usually also found in the denial letter, but the foundational decisions are kind of in both. So what you need to do is look at the real reasons they've denied you from their perspective. Is there not enough evidence? Is the evidence inconsistent with your activity. Does your doctor think you're not impaired? Whatever they're actually alleging, you have to make sure to directly respond to it when you appeal. Um, it can be really helpful, to show a decline from your pre-morbid functioning. If you have medical records from before you became disabled, people often don't think to send those in. I often think you should, just to show the history you're dealing with and to show what you were able to do before you became impaired. One thing I like sometimes when you're filing a claim, and if you were working at a time where coworkers were seeing your decline, ask coworkers and colleagues to write a letter of support, basically saying, how great you were, how hard you were working, and then how hard it was for you before you actually ended up on disability. This is not something available to everyone because some people don't have employees they work with that closely. Some people wouldn't feel comfortable asking their employees, and a big chunk of people have hid everything until they really couldn't anymore because they didn't want to show that they were suffering at all. So if you're thinking, wow, I don't have anyone who can write a letter like that for me, don't worry about it. A lot of people don't, but it's just something that can often help. I used to tell people to ask your supervisor for a letter of support as well. I still recommend doing it. I just don't tell anyone to expect anything. The few times I've gotten supervisors to initially approve, they then talk to the HR who tells them not to help. So it's pretty rare to get a letter from supervisors these days, but no harm in trying. Um, the last thing, as I kind of referenced a little bit before, make sure to comply with your treatment plan. One really easy way to harm your claim unintentionally is by not complying with your doctor's recommendations. I know it's particularly hard with long COVID when you're dealing with multiple specialists, and you may get conflicting recommendations. Sometimes you may get recommendations that you think are dangerous, or the million reasons why a reasonable person wouldn't necessarily comply with a treatment plan. But you have to make sure, if you're not going to agree with what your doctor does, don't just not do it. Tell them why, tell them what your concerns are, tell them that you're going to be listening to a different doctor instead. Because that's much different than you saying, oh, a doctor says to do this, I'm not listening. The insurance company will turn that around on you. That's much different than saying, I don't want to follow your course of action, doctor. I'm going to go with the other doctor because I think it's safer or smarter or more reasonable. So.
And one thing that's not listed here that I think is really important is really finding and working with a doctor who understands you and takes an interest in helping you. Because if you have a doctor who just doesn't really care about long COVID or doesn't want to take the time to understand long COVID, it can really hurt you because you're not going to be getting good recommendations from them. They won't be providing good letters of support. And they could just be resisting helping you. And it's really one of the best things you can do is find a good doctor. We have a question from Brandy. She asks if a insurance company is still debating your STD appeal, can you legally apply for long-term disability without the short-term disability being approved? And I can answer that yes, you can. And what's really great about this is that if it's the same insurance company that manages your short-term and your long-term benefits, and you do get approved for long-term disability while your short-term claim is still denied, it will retroactively approve the short-term claim in most situations. And so if you're dealing with a really long denial for short-term disability and it's just like not working out, go ahead and apply for long-term disability because if you get approved, your short-term claim will probably get approved as well. And then we have another question from the audience. Is it legal for an insurance company to refuse to reschedule an IME? They had a family member who had a conflict with an appointment, so it was rescheduled once, but they since had a medical procedure and needed to reschedule again. Can the insurance company refuse to reschedule a second time?
It's unusual, honestly, because in reality, if they deny the claim because of that, you just appeal and say, okay, now I'm willing to undergo the IME at any date you want, and they're kind of forced to reschedule it anyways. If they were theoretically to deny the claim and they say, okay, well, I'm appealing, I'm ready to go undergo the IME, and they say, no, you blew it, we already tried to reschedule it, a disability lawyer like me would fly in and want to take that case. So I think, frankly, you should strongly consider talking to a long-term disability lawyer who's in your state. I don't know where you live, but there's a lot of good ones out there, and ask for a free consultation. The other kind of, I'll say, dark and horrible suggestion, which I'm not actually suggesting, but it's my job to give you all the legal theories, is that if your family member could potentially push themselves to attend while they're still recovering from an issue, they might appear more impaired than they normally would and might support the claim. Now, I genuinely don't think she should do that. I mean, he or she should do that. I just want them to understand their options, and it's, no one should have to undergo an IME when they're recovering from a procedure. Yeah, so I would really talk to an LTD lawyer. If you want to email me after this, I'm happy to give you some guidance as well.
All right. Anything else on this slide we want to discuss? No.
No.
Let's move on to reasons to work with an attorney when applying or appealing for long-term disability. So, this is a question I get sometimes, and when I explain it, it all just usually clicks for the client. But as many people with long COVID know that, when you have a fatiguing illness, when you're experiencing cognitive issues, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. It's really challenging to stay organized, and having someone on your side that can help take all that stress off of your shoulders and just make the whole process less complicated for you and give you really good, clear guidance and direction. That's really going to go a long way for supporting your claim and eventually getting you approved. So if you aren't working with an attorney, I really highly recommend it. And one of the important things we mentioned earlier was building a strong claim before you even apply, because that's going to go a long way to supporting you as well. And an attorney can really help you do that ahead of time so that you're not denied and then 6 months down the road still trying to find the right medical evidence to submit to support your claim. And I find that it's also a lot easier to persuade an insurance company with the application the first time rather than them going through the process of analyzing your claim and then denying it, and then you have to change their mind. I think it's human nature for people to want to stick to their initial decision, and I think that holds true for this. And then one thing also about working with an attorney is they're going to communicate with the insurer on your behalf. And I know that for a lot of long COVID patients out there, that it's just taking on that additional stress of an insurance company just calling you at any given time and you're put on the spot to, explain your health conditions or what happened and when can just be really stressful and unsettling. And so when you're represented by an attorney, that insurance company is actually not going to be allowed to talk to you directly. They're going to have to go through your attorney. So that can go a long way as well about just taking that stress off your shoulders and just making the whole process go more smoothly. And then there's a lot of procedural things that come up. And Andrew, could you provide some examples of just procedural errors the insurance company could make that could then be leveraged when you get to litigation?
Yeah, there's a few of them. I think the biggest one is failure to comply with the most recent regulations as far as the steps they have to follow before an appeal ends. So what insurers are required to do is give you a copy of information they generate during the appeal, and allow you to respond to it before the appeal closes. Um, and that means as much as they generate, you get to keep responding. So what they're doing these days is they're generating an appeal, generating information, letting you respond, and then just making a decision based off of it, not letting you respond to any of the new information that's been generated. So that's a big one that we can often use against them. We will often make the strategic decision whether to take another bite at the apple because we want to, or to file the lawsuit in order to kind of freeze them in that strategic posture. We're like, hey, they were the ones who decided to not follow the regs, so we're going to move forward with litigation and put the pressure on them to explain why they didn't comply. Another really, I think, massive reason to consider hiring an attorney for the appeal is that under ERISA, the only time you get to submit information in response to the appeal or that ever gets seen by a judge is during the appeal process. And there's a lot of specific evidence, like a neuropsych evaluation or a 2-day CPET, that sometimes is hard to get without assistance. There's also other specialized information. And without getting that in during litigation or during the appeal, a judge will never see it during litigation. And that's unusual compared to basically every other area of law, because in every other area of law, there's discovery. So the lawsuit starts and then the information exchange starts. Like, you get to provide information. And so often in other areas of law, a lawyer get involved. It's like, oh, the reason this case is missing is because you need this one piece of evidence that I can help you get, and here's how you get it. And if we don't get a chance to do that during the appeal, we can't do it during litigation. So that can be really important.
Great points, Andrew. We got one question from the audience. Do you recommend working with a local attorney or a national attorney who may be more familiar with this type of case?
Oh, it depends. So national attorneys, first of all, the answer overall is you absolutely want someone who specializes in disability, ERISA and disability, and ERISA litigation. You do not want someone local who has never really handled a case like this at all just because they're local. So you definitely want a national firm who's familiar with disability over a local lawyer who's not. The national law firms out there come in two forms, really. They are good law firms who, because this law is ERISA and it's federal, they operate in all 50 states because they're good at it. The other form of those law firms are mills, basically, where they put all their money into advertising, they settle 10 cases at once, and you don't get the best service. Both of those types of firms will say that they're experienced with long-term disability and ERISA because they technically are. So my personal recommendation is start by looking for an experienced disability lawyer in your state or who has a practice area in your state. Like we're in California, and we operate in mostly Washington and Oregon and also New York these days. Even when we have people from New York come into us, we'll sometimes send them to New York lawyers that we trust, because they'll be in a better position to handle the case because of the nuances in that state. So I definitely recommend trying, if you find a lawyer who operates in your state and also in other states and they're an expert in disability law, I'd strongly consider hiring them. My best advice for hiring a lawyer is make sure to talk to more than one. Just like when you're trying to find a good doctor, if you have the chance to talk to a few of them, compare their retainer rates to each other, and see who you get the best vibe with. The other question I like telling people to ask is whenever you talk to a lawyer, ask them who they would hire if they couldn't hire themselves. Ask them for their best competitors. Bad lawyers who are really just trying to sign up cases will balk at the question. They'll either find it offensive or they'll say there's no one better than me, or they'll dance around it. Good lawyers will give you a few recommendations because they know that there's other good lawyers out there. So that's kind of my advice to finding a lawyer.
That's some great advice. All right, so we are right on time for our Q&A, the last portion of our webinar today. And one question is circling back to what we talked about earlier with vocational evaluations. So these can be pretty expensive. So Andrew, when would you say is the right time to do a vocational evaluation?
I think a vocational evaluation is usually, it's a good question. The problem is they vary in cost. So I've seen some that cost $1,000, and I've seen some that cost up to $7,000. So it really depends who you have access to, what your financial situation is like. For some people, $1,000 is way too much money to spend when you're not getting your disability benefits. And I understand that completely. So my default recommendation usually is a vocational evaluation is something that can wait, partially because you don't know if they're going to deny the claim. You don't know why they're going to deny the claim. And you don't exactly know what vocational arguments they're even going to make. So it's possible what they say is, there's no evidence of disability at all. We don't think you have any limitations, so you can do any job in the national economy. Well, a vocational evaluation won't really help you because the argument's all about the medicine. You have to get your doctors to argue with them why they're wrong. If they're arguing, yes, we agree that you have limitations and you have fatigue, but we still think you can do your job as a heart surgeon, then you know that that's why they're denying you, and you'd want the vocational person to respond to that. So I guess my response is that is one thing I would probably wait for until you're denied, or at least talk to a lawyer. And if a lawyer disagrees, do what the lawyer says.
Right. Thanks for that. We have one question from Colony. Are there any specific cases that yielded strong results that are based on post-viral or long COVID that could help us? Since the long-term effects are somewhat new. And that's part one of the question, but part two is something I'm going to interject here. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about, how things play out when you're in litigation versus when you're in the administrative appeal when it comes to the type of evidence you can submit and, how the judge or the insurance company will consider that?
So yeah, when you're in the appeal stage, basically, you'll submit all the medical information to them, all the vocational information, and what they'll do is they will have a in-house physician or a peer review physician, which is someone hired by a company, evaluate your entire case. And once they do that, they'll make a decision based on that evaluation. And they make these decisions based on very specific guidelines. Like the people who work at the insurance companies do not have any power. They are cogs in a machine. They're checking boxes. They're forwarding things they need to forward, and there's really not a lot of brain power behind it. And it's really a very mechanical process. This is also why when we make arguments about them interpreting the policy wrong, we never win on appeal. I don't think I've ever won a case, not never, but it's very, very rare to win a case on an appeal with a policy interpretation, because all the claims people can do is rotate the wheels. They're not going to make a decision that's outside of their handbook. The lawyers have to do that. So often we find that extraordinarily strong cases get denied at the appeal level that are very strong for litigation because the insurance companies are really just following their procedure, and there's not a lot of strategic brain power behind it with them. They're just trying to deny as many as they can deny under the guidelines they're trying to deny. When it comes to litigation, a judge. The first thing is a lot of these cases, because they're ERISA, they're heard by, it's a bench trial, just the judge, no jury. So the actual judge you're assigned to becomes exponentially more important for these cases than any other case, because the judge is the jury. So the judge you're assigned to can make or break the case. We can see all of the cases they've decided in the past and see how they decide on ERISA cases, and we can, we've probably been in front of the judge a bunch of times, so we know how they're likely to rule. A lot of cases that go to litigation end up in a lump sum settlement. This is because insurance companies prefer to buy people out other than risk losing at trial and having a case against them that a lawyer like me can cite. Sorry, I just sent you all the wrong case. And because they may have to pay attorney's fees. If you win at litigation, you get reinstated through that day, but still have to go back on claim with them going forward. They don't just pay you automatically until you're entitled to benefits. So clients often prefer a buyout because they don't want to have a relationship with the insurance company again. And a lot of them are still hopeful that they'll go back to work in the future, and maybe, a buyout of 5 years of benefits when they go back to work in 4 years. Hey, that's a net positive. So most cases end up with a lump sum settlement, where there are no lump sum settlements in the appeal stage. All they can do is reinstate your benefit.
And so, digging a little deeper on this, I've seen some case law in my research where when cases get to litigation, there's more case law to support, self-reported symptoms, or there's cases that have held that when an insurance company demands that the claimant produce certain types of evidence that actually is impossible to produce because it doesn't exist for that type of condition, that could mean that the insurance company's denial of those benefits was arbitrary and capricious. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So one big issue with these cases is whether a case is heard under a de novo or arbitrary and capricious standard of review. So one of the first things you'll want to know is which one it'll be if you're litigating a case. What de novo means is that in order to win, you have to win under the normal civil standard, which is basically preponderance of the evidence, 51% right compared to 49% wrong. It's what we all assume is the normal standard in a civil case. But basically, you have to show that you were better at proving your disability than they were not proving the disability. In order to win under an abuse of discretion standard, you have to show they are not only wrong, but unreasonably wrong. So it's much harder to win. In order to show that someone is unreasonably wrong, and thus that they acted arbitrarily and capriciously, one of the things you can do is highlight their mistakes, their procedural irregularities, or just the way they handled the claim when they're evaluating something. One thing we like to point out all the time in lots of different cases is if they don't bother sending someone to an IME, that's arbitrary and capricious, especially if someone has physical issues that you can identify. If someone claims cognitive issues and they deny the claim without sending someone to a neuropsychological evaluation, that's arbitrary and capricious because they're not even bothering to send you to someone to get evaluated. Failing to send you the documents before the appeal closes, all those things can constitute, arbitrary and capricious conduct.
All right, I've got one more question from the audience. Can a one-day CPET be helpful? My take on this is that a CPET is helpful for two reasons. First, to measure your exercise tolerance and capacity. And the second is to measure post-exertional malaise. And I think that a one-day CPET can definitely still provide results to demonstrate that you have exercise intolerance, where a two-day CPET would be more important if you need to show that not only On the first day you might have had a normal result, but it took the second day to show that it was abnormal. So I think it really depends on how the first day goes to see if the second day is warranted. But I definitely think that just a 1 day CPET can be useful if your results are irregular enough. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
All
Um,
right.
yeah, definitely.
Let's see. How much time do we have? We've got 6 more minutes. So let's see which ones we can answer. Um, is there a good way to address a malingering finding in a neuropsychological exam?
That's a really good question. The best way to do it is to hire a different neuropsychologist to review the raw data and hopefully be able to interpret it differently. That's something of a long shot because sometimes they're not able to do it. The other alternative is getting the neuropsychologist to potentially edit their findings to say it wasn't malingering, but it was MECFS, or I mean, it was long COVID or fatigue or something like that. Also a long shot. Um, the other route is to explain it using your doctors and can help them understand what happened and have them explain why they believe you still have cognitive impairment, even though the neuropsych itself wasn't valid. Um, if you're, I don't know if you're on claim right now, whoever asked that, but that's definitely something. Once you get the report, I would look at it closely and consider talking to an LTD lawyer, because if they get an unhelpful neuropsych or a malingering neuropsych, they're going to do everything they can to try and cut off the claim, unfortunately.
Definitely. All right, we've got a question from Shanu. They'd like to know how extreme is surveillance? If their social media is private, can they still see it? They're active on a long COVID subreddit, and they think that would help their case, but they're nervous that they said something there that could be used against them.
Um, I'm on the same subreddit, so I'm sure we've seen each other at some point. So that's a really good question. Surveillance these days comes in two forms: physical surveillance and social media surveillance. With long COVID cases and any kind of really any case, the problem with surveillance comes when it contradicts what you can say you can do, right? So some people assume, oh, if the insurance company ever sees me having a good day, they're going to deny my claim automatically. Not necessarily. If you tell them, hey, I have good days and bad days, and here's what I do on my good days, and they observe you doing exactly what you say you're doing on your good days, they can't really use that against you. The problem comes when you say, I never leave the house because I'm so impaired, and they catch you leaving the house. Even a small contradiction can be really harmful. I'm seeing less and less physical surveillance these days, especially of long COVID and MECFS claims, because for that exact reason, we can just kind of attack it saying it doesn't really mean anything. Social media investigation is you can assume it's happening. If the only way they'd be able to link your name to your Reddit account is if your Reddit account is public. And even then, I'm not entirely sure. They'd have to do a manual search rather than using Ferretly or any of these the systems that link your name. And then, if your Reddit account isn't public, there's no way they should be able to associate it. But to be safe, I would delete the account, delete the comment. Frankly, I don't think they should have a right to review these things. But you know, arguably, one could say that I shouldn't tell you to delete the comment. I should tell you to edit it and give it context. But the reality is, your Reddit should be private, and you know, I wouldn't go sharing too much information about details about your disability claim on Reddit just for that reason.
All right, one more question we have is, do you have any tips on getting medical records revised?
Ask nicely, ask in writing, and make sure you're only asking for factual corrections rather than changes of opinions. Um, and so, I if we don't get to some of the questions that were asked, my hopefully my email address is available. My website's available. If anyone wants to reach out to me and ask me some of these questions, and some of the questions are going to require someone to kind of look at your information kind of closely. Um, One question I did see that I wanted to um, so someone recommended the Dabowski law firm, or oh, you okay, sorry about that. Okay, so did we answer the 1 day CPET question?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's all of them.
All right. Well, I will share Andrew's contact information with everyone who registered, or Andrew, if you just want to put it in the chat for everyone.
Oh yeah, no problem.
And that way you can contact him if you have additional questions you'd like to dig into with him. But I want to thank everyone for attending today. And I want to thank Andrew for coming on today and sharing all of his great knowledge with us. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their week. And you can find our recording of this webinar on our YouTube page probably in the next 24 hours. And we'll talk to you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.